Elvis Presley, the supposed king of rock and roll, stands backstage at a Mississippi venue in 1956, listening intently as a black artist performs the exact song Elvis will soon claim as his own. His manager, Colonel Parker, whispers in his ear, "Remember, make it yours. They won't know the difference." Elvis nods, adjusting his famous sneer in a mirror while the sound of authentic rhythm and blues echoes through the thin walls. Through the crack in the door, he watches black teenagers dance with an electricity he'll soon imitate, step for step, move for move. He isn't creating, he's taking notes. America doesn't want the architect, it wants the facade. And Elvis isn't just a performer. He's the perfect cultural heist in human form, the greatest appropriation machine ever designed to strip black music of its roots while making America comfortable with rock and roll. That opening scene shocks because it clashes with what most people were taught. You learned a different story in school and on TV, the tidy, inspiring rise of a lone genius. Now we turn to that version, the comfortable, polished myth everyone knows. Everyone knows the outline. A poor boy from a small Mississippi town walks into Sun Records in 1953 to record a tune for his mother. Sam Phillips, the visionary producer, spots something special. Overnight, a new sound is launched. Elvis is framed as a messianic figure, the rebel who fused country twang and the heartbeat of rhythm and blues into a brand new music that changed the world. The books, the museum plaques, the Hollywood films tell it with the cadence of inevitability. Talent met fate. Fame followed. Tragedy closed the arc. It's a tidy parable that comforts the listener. It says the system rewards greatness. It says markets and audiences are neutral arbiters of genius. In classrooms and documentaries, the language is soft and authorized. Textbooks write it like this: a natural-born talent. Elvis brought rural country music and urban blues together in a fresh voice. A museum audio guide in tones. From humble beginnings, a star emerged who broke barriers and united a divided nation. A conservative commentator sums it up in a voiceover clip. He didn't divide us, he made America dance together. These are not only sentences, they are moods. They present a past without knots. No exploitation, no structural barriers, no people erased. They are persuasive because they want to be true. They let you enjoy the records while keeping your hands clean. You hear, "That's all right," and you nod at genius. You watch Jailhouse Rock, and you feel the cinematic origin myth settle comfortably into your head. The story works because it removes the friction between America's self-image and the uncomfortable facts of segregation, exploitation, and profit. Visualize the classic tableaus this myth offers. An overhead shot of a neon Memphis sign. A close-up of a sweaty teenage face in a packed sock hop. A steady dolly through Graceland's manicured lawn. Each shot is framed so the origin looks organic. The ascent looks deserved. The fame looks earned. This is the version that becomes canonical because it is marketable and repeatable. Who benefits? Start with the obvious, the record companies. RCA paid Sun Records $40,000 for Elvis's contract, a then astonishing sum, and then built an industrial machine to sell his image. Managers and agents benefited. Colonel Tom Parker, the manager, negotiated publicity and distribution deals that enlarged Elvis's fame and his bank account, and Parker's cut was unusually large, often half the earnings. Hollywood benefited too. Elvis's films filled theaters and created ancillary revenues. Television networks scored huge ratings from Elvis's appearances, reaping ad dollars and demographic claims. Graceland became a tourism engine. Entire local economies found a new currency in the Elvis brand. Beyond money, other beneficiaries are ideological. The image of a white performer popularizing dangerous, black music helped soothe white audiences who enjoyed rhythm and blues but were uncomfortable with the social and political implications of black performers' visibility. In the sanitized narrative, rock and roll becomes a cultural valve, exciting enough to sell records, safe enough to sustain segregation-era sensibilities. The myth also served broader national narratives about individual upward mobility, the American dream recast as a tune with a driving beat. Yet the official account is gloss. It willfully simplifies messy histories, the tangled webs of influence, the markets that preferred white faces, the arrangements that cut original creators out of their due. The official voice rarely, if ever, reads the ledger of who actually wrote songs, whose rhythms were borrowed, whose grooves were smoothed for white radio. In films and museum audio, the story of appropriation is an inconvenient subplot at best and a silence at worst. Listen to how the official voices answer inconvenient questions. When asked about musical debt, the textbook says, Elvis was influenced by an array of sources and honored them by popularizing their sounds. A museum curator will say, Elvis absorbed what he heard, like many artists do the art built on shared traditions. Those quotes are true in a narrow sense, but they omit two critical facts. First, that shared traditions existed inside a segregated economy which systematically blocked direct access to white markets for black artists. And second, that popularizing a sound inside a whitened package generated massive, concentrated profits for white intermediaries while the originators often remained poor and uncredited. Let's step through the neat chapters of the myth and flesh out the scenes you saw on television. Scene 1. The Discovery. The cinematic moment at Sun records a nervous 20-year-old with pompadour, a quick handshake. A fragile demo tape is a perfect film motif. It reads like destiny. A single recording session changes a life. The narrative loves small, luminous turning points. They are simple and filmable. Scene 2. The Breakout. Elvis's appearance on regional radio and then national TV is staged as an explosion. The parents are outraged. The teens are ecstatic. The moral panic becomes proof of authenticity. This is textbook drama. Rebellion births art. You learned it in clips, stunned TV hosts, outraged editorialists, screaming fans at the edges of legitimacy. Scene 3. Expansion. The jump to RCA, the move into films, the quadruple platinum records each becomes proof that the talent was real and the market validated it. You watch the montage. Gold records, sold-out arenas, magazine covers. Legacy is built through repetition. Institutions codify the story because repetition turns news into legend. Scene 4. Sanctification. Graceland, posthumous biographies, authorized tributes. Here the myth is fossilized. The museum does what institutes do. It organizes objects into a tidy cause and effect. The messy economy, the covers, the unpaid writers, the segregated radio waves disappears behind velvet ropes and curated captions. If the myth is a machine, its gears are publicity, selective memory, and institutional inertia. The machine needs narratives that are easy to sell and hard to question. It needs visuals the public can enjoy without moral complication. It needs authorities, critics, producers, museums who validate and amplify the tidy story. When you walk into a museum or watch a nostalgic documentary, you rarely meet the messy people who made the music first. You meet a curated icon, flattered and simplified. That is why the official version is so durable. It smooths conflict into a digestible arc. But now imagine turning that smooth surface and finding hairline cracks. Think of songs played earlier in smoky, segregated clubs. Think of names and liner notes that never appear on plaque descriptions. Think of contracts signed under pressure by performers who didn't live to collect their share. These are not plot holes. They are traces. The next chapters of this investigation will pry at those seams. Before we go further, thank you for staying with this investigation. If you find this kind of story essential, consider subscribing. This channel is new, and reaching 1,000 subscribers will let us investigate more of the hidden histories your school skipped. Every new subscriber helps fund more documents, interviews, and footage. We need you in this room. Now, the official story has been laid out. framed. In the segregated moral world of the 1950s, a white body doing black-derived moves is framed as an exciting rebellion. A black body doing the same was framed as threatening or relegated to race markets. This is not coincidence, it is pattern. The visible novelty is regulated by color. Then there is the blunt commercial calculus announced by those who book talent. Colonel Tom Parker's reported instruction to Sam Phillips, "Find me a white boy who can sing like a Negro," is not a slip of rhetoric. It is a strategy laid bare. It is a plan to capture a market that would otherwise be closed to black performers. It telegraphs intent. The goal was not to celebrate a lineage, but to transfer its aesthetic into a more commercially acceptable form for white audiences. That deliberate strategy complicates the narrative of spontaneous genius and frames Elvis's rise, at least in part, as a commercial translation. Money provides another set of fissures. Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog in 1952 and received a one-time payment. Her record did well on the R&B charts, but it did not secure long-term royalties of the scale that Elvis's cover would produce. When Elvis recorded Hound Dog in 1956, the song became a mammoth hit and a licensing juggernaut. The songwriter and the performer who originally brought the song to life did not share proportionally in the wealth that followed. That discrepancy shows how value was and remains distributed in the music business. The social structures of race shaped who could convert cultural labor into lasting wealth. Then there is the matter of credit and authorship. Otis Blackwell wrote songs that became Elvis standards, Don't Be Cruel, All Shook Up. Blackwell's pen created melodies and hooks that would be forever associated with Elvis's voice. But the fame attached to those songs was Elvis's fame. Songwriters received modest compensation, but not the cultural capital that converts into lasting recognition. That division between the visible performer and the invisible laborer is not unique to Elvis, it is endemic, but in the racialized economy of mid-century America, the invisible laborers were disproportionately black. Contextual evidence piles up. Contemporary interviews with Elvis, notably a 1957 remark, "The colored folks been singing it for more years than I know," is a rare candid admission. It is a line that, if emphasized, would force a national conversation about appropriation. Instead, it was swallowed by the machinery of publicity and rarely foregrounded in celebratory biographies. The omission is telling. Facts existed. The editorial decisions made them invisible. Look at the radio and television structure. Radio playlists were governed by program directors who often avoided songs that sounded too black for white audiences. There were entire hours dedicated to race music or segregated programming. Television was even more conservative. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and other mainstream programs, producers had to stage performances to be acceptable to an integrated television audience. That meant sanitizing certain elements or framing them in context that made them feel safe. What passed through those screens was a moderated version of black-originated energy, exciting, but framed within a white body. Archive evidence helps here. In trade documents, in contracts, in memos, one can trace decisions about markets and packaging. The Sun to RCA transfer for $40,000 is a document of commercial strategy. A small studio's raw product sold to a national corporation with distribution muscle. That sale was about scale. The song's origins didn't matter to the purchaser as long as the product could be sold widely. Once in the RCA pipeline, Elvis's sound was manufactured into a national brand. Then there are the quieter, more human omissions. Consider the careers of contemporaries who were swept aside. Little Richard's trajectory, for instance, is a story of brilliance and exploitation, triumph, spiritual crisis, and long periods of obscurity, punctuated by exploitation and insufficient royalties. Fats Domino fought for radio play in markets that preferred cleaner covers. Chuck Berry's legal troubles and the uneven enforcement of laws around his activities contributed to an erosion of his public standing at critical junctures. These are not isolations. They are patterns that reveal a structural bias in which white performers and managers could convert styles into safer, more consumable packages while leaving originators economically and reputationally vulnerable. You saw the sanitized version in films and museum displays. The sanitized version avoids the ledger. It presents influence as an apolitical, almost spiritual exchange. The reality on the ledger is different. The conversion of cultural practice into cash and legacy followed racial logics. The ledger is where power lives. Now imagine the backstage, not the stage. The corridors where managers and record executives make decisions. Late-night meetings over whiskey, reservations about who to book on network television, calculations about which radio markets to target. These private rooms were where the myth was engineered. In those meetings, the calculus was cold and explicit. Which performer will allow us to sell this sound to a wider audience without provoking a political backlash? The answer was not born from a love letter to musical heritage. It was a corporate calculation. Archive scenes help make this concrete. Picture a dim office at RCA. A cigar smoke haze, telegrams detailing pressing runs, an executive circling markets with a pencil, a memo recommending that a certain song be pushed to southern stations because it had an acceptable sound for those listeners. Or picture Sam Phillips, scribbling notes about artists while considering the offer from RCA, a mix of pride in discovering something real and the pragmatic decision to sell to a corporation that could amplify the product. Those contradictions are human, but they are also the anatomy of extraction. Not every omission was malicious in the sense of explicit villainy. Some actors like Elvis himself showed sincere admiration for black performers. He spent nights in Memphis clubs. He praised artists privately. But admiration did not translate into advocacy or structural change. Private praise without public action is a moral ambivalence that allowed the system to persist. Elvis could have used his platform to challenge inequities. Instead, the platform cemented the benefits of the existing order. Consider also the performer's personal position. Fame created both agency and dependency. Elvis's dependence on Parker, the record companies, and the infrastructure that promoted him meant his choices were constrained. That does not absolve him of agency, but it complicates the moral picture. He was not merely a puppet. He was also the most effective conduit the system had found to transmit black-derived music into white mainstream consumption, and he profited handsomely in the bargain. This sequence of contradictions, sonic copying, staged bodily authenticity, explicit commercial directives, financial asymmetries, media gatekeeping, and private/pubic dissonance adds up to something larger than incidental injustice. It reads like a pattern. The myth of spontaneous genius is undermined not by one isolated fact, but by the weight of colliding evidence. What does the existence of these fissures imply? At a minimum, it implies that the standard origin story of rock and roll is incomplete and misleading. It implies that the music industry functioned as a racial translation economy. It translated black innovation into white marketable forms. That economy did not simply elevate new sounds, it redistributed cultural capital into new hands, with predictable racial effects. These are the first and most immediate fissures in the official narrative. They should unsettle the listener because they are not quibbles about taste, they are about credit, power, and money. They show that the version of history you learned at a glance in documentaries omits an entire ledger of human labor and institutional decision-making. The next section will follow these cracks deeper into private rooms, contracts, and the networks that profited. If the first fissures made you question the origin story, what follows will show how those doubts lead to a darker engine in the shadows, a machine of promotion, omission, and selective memory that turned a patchwork of black innovation into a single crowned king. Behind the sequins and the stage lights, the story tightens. The public saw hair, hips, and a voice amplified. The private rooms kept ledgers, contracts, and conversations that decided which lives would be bright and which would. Now imagine a supply chain instead. Press rooms writing headlines, record press plants scheduling runs, radio program directors penciling in playlists, church leaders whispering complaints to sponsors, publicists drafting sanitized bios. Every node has an interest. Sam Phillips at Sun Records is proud and impatient. He understands the music's roots. RCA's executives smell scale and make a war room around distribution lists. Parker counts the cuts, and the cuts become a plan. The plan is to take a dangerous sound one associated with black life, dance halls, and Jim Crow margins, and let it be heard by white America only when repackaged as safe spectacle. Scenes flicker. A dim office downtown where RCA men trace train routes and white market radio maps with a stubby pencil. A sunlit lunch where a magazine editor is handed the humble origins narrative and told it's the brand story. A small legal room where contracts are smoothed into clauses that favor the label and the manager. There is a ledger in one of these rooms worn, ink smudged. On one page, a flat fee for a black artist's recording. The next page lists projected royalties for a future cover. The arithmetic is cold. The personal contradictions sharpen the portrait. Elvis, offstage, is both sincere in his admiration and passive in his silence. He sits through late-night sessions on Beale Street until his eyes water from the smoke and the sweat, and he will later describe an experience of awe. But later, on a quick press run, he will accept the sanitized story, the truck driver myth, the one record for his mother image, the amiable star lost in sudden fame. Why? Because the infrastructure around him, a manager taking an extraordinary half of his income, a major label promising global distribution, television bookings that pay in visibility and sponsorship rather than royalties confines choices. The man who once stood in smoky clubs has little appetite for public fights over royalties or credit when $500,000 and national fame hang in the balance. That tension between private admiration and public convenience becomes one of the story's most human fractures. At other tables, different actors move. Songwriters, many of them black, send demo sheets and receive modest sums. Performers on the race music circuit tour on short contracts and sleep in segregated hotels. Fats Domino argues for radio play in a Memphis studio. His manager keeps tally of stations refusing his record because it sounded too black. Little Richard signs a contract after a late-night phone call that promises exposure but not equitable pay. In the background, a wave of covers begins to roll. Songs re-recorded, tempos polished, lyrics adjusted. The covers sell to markets that the originals could not enter. The result? The rhythm survives. The originators often do not. You can almost hear the calculus. A white performer can perform the same riff without the social consequence. They will be framed as a safe outlet for youthful rebellion. The path of least resistance becomes the path that profits. Parker's repeated instruction, "Find me a white boy who can sing like a Negro," is less a vulgar joke than a business model. It is a map, and the map gets followed. But not everything in the backrooms is merely transactional. There are quieter corners where people speak in the language of grief and loyalty. Sam Phillips writes letters to friends about the music he loved and the artists he respected. Musicians meet in diners in the early morning hours to swap leads and to mourn how little the charts reflect their influence. Elvis privately writes notes of gratitude and admiration to singers who shaped him. Those notes are human artifacts, real, affecting, and yet they do not change the distribution of power. The contradiction hardens into an impending fault line. The system can operate because media, law, and markets all collude, sometimes tacitly, sometimes deliberately, to smooth over origin stories. But systems crack when politics, economics, and culture collide. And the late 1960s bring more than a new sound. They bring a new public conversation about race and rights. In those backrooms, Whispers begin about how to reposition Elvis for a country that is angrier and more divided than it was a decade earlier. The choices made offstage now have a different weight. What we have seen in these corridors is not a single theft, but a distributed process: selection, translation, sanitization, and amplification. It is work performed by many hands, each with motives that range from the purely financial to the reputational to the cowardly. And those hands are preparing, unavoidably, for a moment when the polished public narrative will be tested against a more restless nation. The question is whether the machine will bend or whether the machine will rewrap itself yet again. Either way, the coming crack will be loud. The comeback special in 1968 arrives like a cinematic pivot. The cameras are warm, the audience is invited to witness a reinvention, and the network promises spectacle. Elvis is framed as returning, the prodigal star stepping out of a quiet exile back into the national pantheon. The program is a masterful piece of staging a central set with a gritty club vibe, choreographed band shots, intimate black and white close-ups. It is also a lesson in how television can rewrite context. In the weeks before the taping, production memos circulate. One note reads like a strategy brief: make Elvis both dangerous and domesticated. Use leather to suggest edge. Underline the roots, but never place the roots in the foreground. The language is telling. The special will borrow the aesthetics of black R&B, the leather suit, the swagger, the call and response with backing vocalists, and will present them as Elvis's reclamation. It will not foreground the music's political meaning or the artists whose shoulders he stands on. Instead, it offers a controlled rebellion, one that can be consumed in living rooms across America while advertisers sip their coffee. You are watching the recording as an exercise in narrative engineering. The first performance hits hard. Raw guitar, hairy drums, a voice that sounds, to many viewers, both rehabilitated and taut with control. The cameras circle. The audience, largely white and largely suburban, roars, and then settles into an acceptance that feels like relief. For many viewers, Elvis isn't a conduit of black culture. He is an emblem of youthful excitement that does not threaten the social order. The special's ratings, nearly half the country tuning in, confirm that the packaging has worked. At the same time, across the airwaves and across the cities, black artists are doing something else entirely. In the same year, James Brown is releasing "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." Hundreds of venues and radio stations are hosting music that is not seeking a domesticated middle ground, but is explicitly arguing for dignity and rights. Brown's music carries a political urgency that the comeback special studiously avoids. The contrast is stark on a national scale. While Brown sings insistence and autonomy, Elvis performs stylized energy that's been scrubbed of its insistence and autonomy. The consequences are not merely symbolic. The special repositions Elvis as a nostalgic anchor at a moment when black artists are saying, "We are not simply entertainment, we are part of a movement." The television event absorbs the energy of black music while simultaneously deflecting its demand for recognition. At a time when record sales and festival lineups could have supported a deeper conversation about credit and royalties, the nation chooses spectacle instead. The spectacle sells well. Look at the aftermath. Sales spike. Booking agents call. RCA sees numbers move. Parker collects fees and signings get renewed. Graceland, already an artifact of celebrity, becomes more myth than home. Meanwhile, the people who had been the engines of the sound, Little Richard, Big Mama Thornton, Chuck Berry, continue to fight smaller battles. Unpaid royalties, discriminatory venue policies, legal entanglements. Some take their claims to court, others, exhausted, withdraw. The irony is searing. The very sound that re-energized a generation's politics has been domesticated in prime time while its originators negotiate for cents on a ledger. Archive footage and memos show more. Internal RCA documents proposing merchandising strategies, producers deciding which footage makes the edit, columnists drafting the human interest angle about a boy from Tupelo reborn. Each act of editing is an act of selection, and each selection helps a version of Elvis. Yet the record is not entirely closed. Lawsuits, biographies, and later scholarship begin to fill in what was omitted. Musicians and journalists keep telling other stories, inconvenient ones, personal ones, stubborn ones. The fissures remain visible if you know where to look. Royalty statements that don't match sales, session notes without proper credits, contemporaneous reviews that mention different names. These traces, when gathered, do more than indict a manager or a singer. They reveal a system that chose profit over provenance. The what happened next is maddeningly practical. The show's success feeds tours, films, and licensed products. Elvis becomes an evergreen brand divorced from grievance. The nation moves on in its ways, sometimes remembering the music and forgetting the ledger. And yet the ledger's omissions keep piling up like unpaid invoices. Through the 1970s and beyond, families of originators file claims, historians write corrective chapters, and activists point to the economic inequality underlying cultural celebration. As the smoke settles in the wake of the special, a question hangs over the spectacle. How did so much documented evidence about appropriation and inequality end up narrated into reverence? The answer, as we soon see, is the work of a system, not a single villain, not a single saint. The system knows how to refocus attention, how to repeat phrases until they sound true, and how to wrap a complex history into a palatable emblem. The comeback special is one of those wrapping moments, beautiful on its surface and consequential beneath it. If the comeback special is the turning point, the machine that makes myths is the slow and persistent artisan behind it. Propaganda here is not a crude set of posters. It is a layered, iterative craft. It begins with language. Natural talent, unique voice, American original. Those phrases are simple, repeatable, and comfortable. They are easier to sell than synthesis, translation, or repackaging. So the first tool in the factory is vocabulary. Follow the vocabulary into press rooms. Publicists draft short, warm stories about a boy from Mississippi. Journalists, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, run them as human interest pieces. Filmmakers take the beats and shape them into narratives. The discovery, the rise, the fall. Each medium takes one frame and polishes it. A biopic will need a tidy protagonist arc. A museum exhibit will prefer objects you can hang a caption on. A textbook will compress decades into a single paragraph. The simplicity is compelling. The simplicity is profitable. Film and television play a privileged role. Hollywood builds a visualization of Elvis that becomes iconic. Suits, settings, scenes set to music. A popular film can fix the image of origin in millions of viewers' minds faster than an academic monograph can correct it. When audiences see a movie version of Jailhouse Rock or a glossy biopic montage, they absorb the implied authorship. Repetition breeds belief. Radio and program directors are another gear. They decide what enters mainstream playlists and when. In the 1950s, this meant segregated hours and risk-averse schedules. In later decades, it meant promotion budgets favored to those labels willing to underwrite advertising and lobbying. The practical effect is the same. Some tracks get amplified and others are nudged into specialized slots. Over time, what gets played most becomes what is remembered most. Academia and canonization complete the process. When histories are written by institutions with their own blind spots, certain narratives solidify. Books that center a single figure as a founding genius create shorthand for educators and the public. Once a story is in print and cited, it accrues authority. The inconvenient names recede into footnotes or disappear. That is how a commercial story becomes an authorized history. Then there is Graceland, the house frozen in time and repurposed as a pilgrimage site. Museums do more than preserve objects. They organize meaning. The curated rooms, the costumes, The gold records on the wall, they create a tangible myth. Visitors walk through and are given a prescribed emotional arc. Humble origins, meteoric rise, tragic decline. The complexity of sources, of labor, of exploitation is rarely on the audio guide. The shrine is persuasive because it is beautiful and ceremonial. It makes a person into iconography. Consider the amplification effects of merchandise and tourism. A framed photograph, a t-shirt, a cardboard cutout, each object carries a tiny lesson about what matters in the story. Multiply that across thousands of households and airports and classrooms, and the lesson becomes cultural shorthand. Consumer demand and nostalgic economies invest in the simplified story and thus reinforce it. Merchandising is the final stage of the myth machine. It turns history into commodity. But manufacturing a myth also requires erasure. Records are left uncatalogued. Credits are amended or omitted. Legal settlements are quietly signed. Archival footage that complicates the story is shelved. These are not always dramatic conspiracies. Often they are bureaucratic choices: what to digitize, what to preserve, what to highlight. Over time, those choices aggregate into a curated past that looks inevitable. This machinery is adaptive. When critics point to omissions, the industry responds with partial concessions, reissues with bonus tracks, liner notes giving some credit, a documentary that nods to influences. These are real and sometimes meaningful corrections, but they are seldom accompanied by systemic reparations, equitable royalties, rewritten curricula, or shared heritage projects that put originators first. The corrections polish the surface without replacing the engine. And the engine's lesson is clear beyond Elvis. The template is replicable. A commercially viable figure absorbs and rebrands innovation. The system amplifies, the market monetizes, and the myth ossifies. Look at contemporary examples. When white artists in black-originated genres receive mainstream awards and commercial deals that dwarf those available to the genre's pioneers. When fashion houses monetize street aesthetics without credit. When food media leonizes new discoverers of long-standing cultural practices. These are not isolated phenomena. They are echoes of the same mechanism we have just traced. This is not only a story of theft. It is a story of structural choices that shape who receives attention, whose work turns into capital, and whose labor remains invisible. It is a political story as much as a cultural one. The apparatus that manufactures myths also sets the terms of belonging and prestige. It decides who is a genius and who is an influence. And it does so using every social lever available: money, media, law, education, and memory. The more we examine the tools: press strategy, cinematic framing, radio programming, academic canonization, museum curation, merchandise, the clearer one thing becomes. None of these steps were unknowingly neutral. They were decisions. Not every decision was malevolent. Many were pragmatic. But pragmatic choices add up. Pragmatism plus power creates patterns. And patterns, when repeated over decades, become institutions. So what remains after the machine has done its work? Not a tidy villain or a single cleared hero, but a landscape of responsibility. There are people who acted with calculation, others who acted from vanity, and many who simply accepted the incentives of the moment. There are survivors, claimants, lawyers, historians, and families still seeking recognition. There are songs with dual lives, original grooves in vinyl crates, and popular covers in stadiums. There are classrooms where history is still taught in a way that smooths edges rather than exposes ledgers. If you step back, the uncomfortable truth is this: to understand cultural history honestly requires examining systems, not just personalities. It requires asking who wrote the captions, who chose which footage to run, and who profited when a sound crossed a color line. It requires agreeing that affection for a performer can coexist with critique of the structures that elevated them. And it requires, finally, deciding what to do with what we find. After dismantling the machine, an uneasy but necessary silence forms. The myth is not fully gone. Echoes persist in playlists, in museum audio, in commemorative stamps. But the machinery is now. The honest portrait keeps both facts. Elvis could sing, and he sang in a tradition he learned from others. He heard the music. He copied, absorbed, and then amplified it with the assets his whiteness granted him: television time, mainstream radio, major label promotion. Appreciation stacked on top of structural advantage produces outcomes that look like genius. His voice, raw, elastic, and capable of sudden tenderness. He used it with a craft he polished over long nights listening to records and live bands. That is not insignificant. Talent matters. But talent plus access matters more. Timing mattered. The post-war boom, new radio technologies, and a youth market hungry for rebellion. These historical forces are part of the portrait. To call him merely talented is true but inadequate. To call him the origin is false. Then there is Colonel Tom Parker, the human fulcrum of Elvis's career. Parker's choices reshaped the portrait from accidental celebrity to intentional product. A manager who took half his client's income, who limited international touring for obscure legal reasons, who controlled which images reached print and which songs were recorded. Parker was less an agent of culture than an engineer of demand. If Elvis was the engine, Parker designed the gearbox that transmitted the power to a market hungry for sanitized rebellion. The portrait must show Elvis in private rooms listening to artists he admired: Jackie Wilson, Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, and then show him on soundstages where decisions were being made without them. This duality is central. He loved the music and the people who made it. Yet there is a long record of choices that did not translate into public advocacy, reparative contracts, or insistence on proper credits for originators. He admired, he did not lobby. That silence mattered. Morally, this portrait resists easy judgment. There are moments that suggest genuine warmth. Musicians recall invites to Graceland, small acts of generosity, a star-struck zeal that feels sincere. But there are also documented omissions, song credits that never made it into liner notes, royalties that flowed in unequal directions, and a career strategy that prioritized broad acceptability. To place both sides on the table is not to excuse. It is to understand how a person becomes the node of a system. The methods are mundane and practical, not cinematic conspiracies. Contracts were written in precise legalese. Radio promoters made cold calculations. Record executives ran spreadsheets. Publicists shaped language. Phrases like natural talent and American original were inserted until they gained the weight of truth. The portrait must include these small, repeated acts of selection. They are the mortar of the myth. We should also map the human costs more concretely. Artists like Arthur, Big Boy Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, and others did not simply supply influence. They were the immediate producers of work that would be repackaged and monetized by others. Many endured unfair contracts, missing credits, and the erosion of opportunity. The honest portrait notes their absence from the throne room and adds their names back into the narrative. To humanize Elvis while naming those he benefited from is not contradiction, it is correction. Finally, the honest portrait looks forward. It recognizes that Elvis's popularity reshaped markets in ways that had long-term consequences. Rock and roll entered the mainstream through him, and that helped dismantle some cultural taboos. But it also normalized a pathway to commercial success that often excluded the originators. The portrait refuses to be reductive. Elvis is neither the single architect nor the sole thief. He is a figure who, through a combination of aptitude, timing, and racial privilege, became the most visible translator of a black-born musical language into national capital. That translation had enormous cultural effects, some liberating, some erasing. When you put all of this together, the voice, the gestures, the private admiration, the managerial calculus, the missing credits, you are left with a disquieting clarity. Elvis mattered because he was good. He mattered more because the industry around him was good at turning him into a product palatable to whitened America. The portrait ends not with absolution nor damnation, but with a demand. If we want to honor the music honestly, we must name the builders and change the ledger. There is more to follow. The portrait raises a practical question. If Elvis was the most successful cultural broker of his era, who pays the debts owed by that brokerage? The answer will shape our understanding of culture, restitution, and how we remember genius. Walk into any modern music award show, and you will see the template live. Genres born in Black communities are stylized, repackaged, and often rewarded in ways that reward whiteness disproportionately. That is the living legacy of the Elvis story. The mechanisms that turned a sound into a superstar keep operating, less visibly but still effectively, across industries and decades. Start with streaming platforms. Algorithms and editorial playlists decide what millions hear first. Labels with capital deploy sophisticated promotion budgets to nudge tracks into those playlists. The result: songs by artists with fewer resources, often from marginalized communities, stay buried in niche categories, while well-funded artists gain prime visibility. You learn to accept playlists as neutral. In practice, they are curated attention economies that reproduce old patterns of access. Think of fashion. Street aesthetics originating in Black and Latino neighborhoods appear on runways with a new stamp and vastly higher price tags. The originators are rarely credited. The collectors and advertisers reap the profits. The Elvis precedent made this playbook plausible. Find a compelling aesthetic from outside the mainstream, distill its edges, and sell it safely to a larger, wider market. The profit margins are predictable. The moral hazard remains. Look at food culture. Television shows exult when a celebrity chef discovers a regional cuisine. Local cooks and communities that refine those recipes for generations are, at best, seasonal footnotes. This pattern repeats the Elvis era's dynamic. Cultural practices normalized within marginalized communities get translated into lucrative cultural products for mainstream profitable, digestible, picturesque. In music itself, the echoes are clear. White performers who leverage Black-originated forms hip-hop, R&B, house sometimes gain mainstream awards and blockbuster deals that dwarf those available to pioneers working in the same idioms. Our playlists and press cycles celebrate novelty, but novelty is often novelty in form, not origin. The result is a persistent misallocation of cultural capital. Cultural tourism compounds the effect. Graceland is a model. It converts a life into a pilgrimage and a commodity. People stand in line, buy T-shirts, send postcards. The house freezes a selective narrative in amber. Across the globe, many other sites do the same. Shrines that tell tidy stories, exclude complexity, and monetize memory. Tourism economies depend on simplified myths. They thrive on incomplete histories. What about the remedial gestures we sometimes see? Liner note changes, reissues with bonus tracks, or documentaries that gesture toward origins. These do matter. They make names visible again, but they rarely translate into structural restitution, shared catalogs, equitable royalty splits, reform of radio and streaming policies, or funding for archival projects that prioritize communities rather than corporations. A bonus track is not a corrected economy. There are legal and institutional barriers that keep inequality in place. Copyright law, licensing practices, and the norms of contract negotiation favor entities with resources and knowledge. Musicians from marginalized backgrounds historically lacked access to legal counsel, and the shadow of that gap persists. When a song swings from the margins into the mainstream, the settlements and credits are often decided before the rest of the industry has fully noticed the origin story. That matters for intergenerational wealth. At the cultural level, the Elvis precedent shaped how we teach and remember. Textbooks, museum labels, and documentary narratives often center a face and a tidy origin. Sister Rosetta Tharpe's electric guitar, for example, rarely opens mainstream rock histories the way Elvis's Jumpstart does. Corrective scholarship exists. It is persuasive, but it moves. Structural change requires policy, legal action, and institutional, while the same levers that created the myth must be used to correct it. Finally, the Elvis pattern warns us about narratives of innocence. New technologies, AI, recommendation engines, viral marketing amplify culture at unprecedented speed. The old mechanics of appropriation adapt quickly. An aesthetic can be scraped, repackaged, and monetized globally in a single viral cycle. The ledger can be rewritten faster than communities can claim credit. That acceleration is the primary danger. Appropriation without remediation on a planetary scale. The hidden legacy is therefore double-edged. It is a template for immense cultural diffusion and a persistent mechanism for economic exclusion. Recognizing both sides is the first step. Acting to rebalance things, rethinking royalties, reforming platforms, supporting originators directly would be the second. The question that follows is not only historical, it is urgent. You came here thinking you would find a single answer about a single man. Instead, you found a system that made one man's face a shorthand for a much larger story. The path we traced moved from an electric backstage in Mississippi to boardrooms, to television studios, to museum gift shops, and finally, to your streaming playlist. Each stop showed the same pattern: talent shaped by access, origin erased by amplification, profit captured by those who control distribution. If a carefully manufactured narrative could make Elvis into the origin story for an entire genre, what other obvious truths around us are the result of the same machinery? What names are missing from the plaques and the credits you accept as final? And crucially, when a culture can build wealth by simplifying another people's history, who will write the restitution ledger, and how will they pay what is owed? Thank you for staying with this investigation. If you want to keep opening archives like this one, subscribe and be part of the conversation. Share where you saw this story for the first time: school, a movie, a museum, and leave a note about someone whose name should be better known. This channel is small and growing. Your subscription helps us fund deeper dives, secure source documents, and bring more obscured voices into the light. This is just one file in a bigger dossier. If this history unsettled you, know this: there are more stories like it, other faces, other industries, other myth machines waiting to be opened. Which one do you want us to pull apart next?